Good afternoon, and welcome to our program entitled Mosquito Threats and Controls, a panel discussion for camp and recreational land managers. Today, we will hear from mosquito experts who understand the health concerns mosquitoes pose and provide information on protective measures and integrated pest management strategies. My name is Andrea Sylvian with EPA Region 1, New England office, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator. Before we begin our panel discussion, I have the honor of introducing Assistant Administrator for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, Alexandra Dunn.
Well, thank you, Andrea. So good to have that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to EPA Region 1's webinar on mosquito threats and control measures. Again, as stated, I am down here in Washington, D.C. as the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. You might wonder what the name of that office has to do with pesticides and chemicals, but in fact, our office handles all insecticide registrations as well as herbicides and other products. So we are the place where insecticides and certainly products for insect control are registered and managed. So that's why I'm here. And I do want to wish all of you participating the best in this unprecedented time around the public health emergency. I want to thank you for your efforts to be on this call during the pandemic, and particularly as managers of outdoor recreation areas, you really are on the front lines of issues like mosquito control. And now you're facing a new suite of public health demands at a time when more and more Americans are turning to their local parks and campsites for family vacations and weekend getaways. And the last thing that we want is to have people looking for a break from home to have to worry about some sort of mosquito-borne illness. So with that in mind, I'm really glad that we have such a great group of experts for today's panel, and we have just a wonderful, timely topic and a great audience. Today's webinar, I think some of you may have been with us last week for the first in the two-part series on webinars for recreational land managers, public health professionals, and other outdoor recreation sector stakeholders who are all working to protect the public. Last week's webinar, we focused on tick management, and today, as you've heard, we're going to talk about mosquito control. But without all of you, we would not be able to take such good care of the public who are enjoying our parks and beaches and wetlands, and you all are part of the front line of making those areas safe for people to enjoy them. I'm also happy to be on this webinar with my colleagues from Region 1. Some of you may know that I spent all of 2018 in the New England region as Regional Administrator for Region 1 or EPA New England, and was in Massachusetts where I have family, and loved being with all of you up there. Know how much people are outdoors and how present these issues are around insect-borne illnesses, and how much people worry about them and ask questions about them. So I certainly understand the need for today's webinar, and we want to be a great partner with all of you and give you the resources and information that can help from the US EPA. Certainly, we know that mosquito dangers are present across the country, but that each region of the country has its own unique set of vectors, threats, and different management needs. And that's why for today's webinar, we're going to focus on the unique needs of the New England specific environment and mosquito management in the mosquito risk profiles that are present in New England. We're also going to talk about some practical solutions and some other takeaway information. I do want to say, as we continue in the public health pandemic issues, earlier today I was asked by someone whether mosquitoes could transmit COVID. It's according to the World Health Organization, in all capital letters, the mosquitoes cannot transmit COVID. But that might be one of the questions that you're getting. And with regard to COVID, you are keeping our parks and our public spaces clean and healthy for people to engage. Please visit EPA List N, as in Nancy, to take a look from your mobile device or your computer at all the products that we have approved as being effective to treat the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we will provide links to those COVID-related resources at the end of the webinar. So in closing, thank you in the backdrop of this global pandemic for being focused on the fact that we have regular risks posed by insects, and we need to focus on them even when people are highly distracted by other events in the world and around them in their community. Mosquito-related illnesses are a threat every year, and particularly during the summer in New England. And so again, from our chemical safety team here in Washington, D.C., for those of us that regulate the pesticides, we want to make sure that everything we do is supportive of your work. And please do not hesitate to reach out to us in Washington, but particularly to the team in EPA New England. And with that, I am really pleased to pass the virtual podium to New England's Regional Administrator, Dennis Diesel. When Dennis was appointed to this role, and I was heading out of the role, he mentioned to me right away that he thought one way we would be able to keep working together is on the insect-borne illness issues. We know last year there was triple E in New England as well. So I'm really commending Dennis for his vision of having this webinar series and for making sure that we were proactive in New England. And I'm really happy to be a part of it. So Dennis, the podium is yours.
Well, thanks, Alex. I am honored, and I love doing these events with you. We make a good partnership. Thanks also for your leadership in EPA New England when you were here, and as you continue your role at headquarters and working on chemical and pesticide issues. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Dennis Diesel. I'm the Regional Administrator for EPA New England, as Alex mentioned. I would like to start by echoing what Alex said. In the middle of the pandemic, I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. I do know that despite these unprecedented operational, personal, professional challenges, I'm grateful to everyone on this call today and our entire community, really, of partners throughout New England for your tireless ongoing efforts to protect public health. As a native New Englander, and a little shout out to New Hampshire, I certainly understand and appreciate the challenges facing all of us as we balance the benefits of time spent outdoors with the risk of exposure to mosquito-related illnesses. The COVID alert signs on the Mass Pike remind us all of the triple E warnings encountered throughout New England last summer and the summer before. The ever-present and seemingly ever-growing risks from mosquitoes, and as we heard last week from ticks, drives a hard truth that we've been learning in New England for decades. Every year, these illnesses have been affecting more people in more communities and in new and changing ways. At EPA New England, one of the ways we can help is by bringing you, the experts, together for webinars like this, where CDC researchers, state practitioners, and EPA pesticide managers can share examples of best practices and innovative approaches to managing these risks. Hopefully, many of you were able to join us last week for our tick control measures webinar, the first half of this two-part series, as Alex referenced. While the tactics we rely upon to address public health threats from mosquitoes and ticks vary greatly, we recognize that, for the most part, we rely on you, the outdoor recreational professionals, to keep us safe from both threats. If you missed the webinar last week, please reach out to our team at EPA New England to learn more about what we covered, how we can help, and what resources were shared. I think that'll be on the web also soon. As Alex noted also, campgrounds and recreation areas have begun to open and have indeed been some of the first places visited by the public. In fact, next week I'll be going to a campground myself, so I look forward to getting outside and in a socially distant, responsible way, and also avoiding ticks and mosquitoes as much as I can. We do hope you find today's information and resources on threats and control measures to be valuable and timely. As you work this summer to keep our families safe from mosquitoes and ticks, please keep letting us know how we can help. At the end of today's presentation, our panelists will be joined by representatives of our New England State pesticide programs to answer your questions about mosquito control. With that, again, thank you for joining us today. I'll turn the webinar over to today's moderator, a member of our New England EPA pesticide program, Andrea Sylvian. So, Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Assistant Administrator Dunn and Regional Administrator Diesel. Our agenda today includes a panel discussion from both national and regional experts who will discuss mosquitoes and mosquito control. The focus will be on mosquito problems in campgrounds and recreational areas. Here are a few tips for viewing our webinar. To toggle between a maximized and standard view of the presentation, click on the four corners symbol highlighted by the yellow arrow. If you are having technical difficulties, press the raise your hand icon highlighted with the blue arrow, and we will do our best to help. To download the PDF version of the presentation, press the paper icon highlighted in green. To pose a question, use the question box shown with the red arrow. Our panelists today include Roxanne Connolly, PhD, who is the Chief Entomologist, Entomology and Ecology Team at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Fort Collins, Colorado. Matthew Osborne is the Zoonotic Project Coordinator and Program Manager, Arbovirus Surveillance for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health in Boston, Massachusetts. Priscilla Matten is the Superintendent at the Bristol County Mosquito Control Project located in Attleboro, Massachusetts. Roxanne, we will begin with you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I am Roxanne Conley with the Centers for Disease Control. I work in Fort Collins, Colorado, and as was mentioned earlier, I'm with the Division of Vector-Borne Diseases. The team I lead is within the Arboviral Diseases branch, so our focus is on mosquitoes and the viruses that they may transmit to humans. I have been at CDC for almost 3 years now. I've spent 17 years at the University of Florida as a professor working with the mosquito control districts and health departments throughout the state of Florida. Today I'm going to give sort of a national, a broad overview of mosquitoes and mosquitoes of borne diseases of concern. I'm going to talk a little bit about mosquito biology and their life cycle. I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific habitats that might be of interest to campground and land managers, mention a couple of species of note that are here primarily because of humans, and mention some of the diseases of national concern. And then at the end, I'll provide a few resources, links on our website, and then lead into some speakers who will give you some very more regional information on mosquito-borne diseases. Mosquitoes go through 4 life stages. They start out in the egg stage, which is in the upper left corner. This is an example of what we call a floodwater mosquito egg, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about eggs in a minute. There's really 2 different sort of egg-laying behaviors that we look at. One is called floodwater, and the other is called permanent water. So these are floodwater eggs. Once the eggs hatch, they turn into larvae, and the larvae go through 4 instars. During each of these instars, they're feeding on what's in the water. They're getting a little bit bigger. They shed their skin, and then they molt into a larger size. Towards the end of that 4th instar, they stop feeding, and then they turn into pupae. I did want to point out on the larval picture in the upper right-hand corner, actually it's at the top of the picture, you can see what's a breathing siphon that's at the end of each of these mosquito larvae, and that's where they come to the surface, get oxygen to breathe. So once they turn into pupae, the pupal stage is non-feeding. It is aquatic, so both the larval and pupal stages are aquatic. They don't feed as pupal. They don't have any functional mouth parts, but they are active, so they can swim around in their habitat. They spend about 3 days in this stage, and then they emerge as adults. The photos you see of the adults include a female mosquito on the left, and then a male mosquito of the same species on the right. One of the ways that we distinguish males from females is by looking towards the head, looking at the antennae. The male antennae are very feathery, very fuzzy looking, whereas the antennae on females are very sparsely haired. There's another way to tell if you have a female mosquito in the area, and that is if they are feeding on you. So both the males and females feed on sugar for flight energy, but the females require a blood meal for their eggs. And so if you are being bitten, it is a female that's biting you. And I want to mention that in addition to humans, there's a whole range of other organisms that mosquitoes will feed on. Birds, mammals, you see some frogs and snakes in this photograph. Some mosquitoes are very strict in what they feed on, so they may only want to feed on birds. Some may only want to feed on large mammals, so humans and horses, for example. And then we have some species that they don't really care what it is. As long as there's blood there, they'll feed on it. And I just wanted to point out in this photograph, or in this slide, in the bottom center, to the right of the rabbit, that is a mosquito feeding on a frog. And then in the center, top portion of the slide, that is a swarm of salt marsh mosquitoes in the background, but they were documented feeding on pythons that are in the Florida Everglades. And I want to mention something that's not in the photograph here, but there's been a new discovery, I think within the last 2 years, that we have a publication, and there's some footage of mosquitoes actually feeding on earthworms and leeches. So we're learning more stuff about mosquitoes all the time. After they finish, the female takes her blood meal. It takes about 3 days generally for her to digest that blood meal and then start looking for a place to lay her eggs. And what I have listed here are those sites that she would be looking for. So permanent water and flood water, I mentioned earlier, they're kind of subjective, but in general, permanent water stays in place for a long period of time. It doesn't fluctuate too much throughout a season, whereas flood water is more ephemeral. It may be there for a few days, perhaps a couple of weeks, but usually tends to fluctuate quite a bit more. Permanent water habitats include ponds, the edges of lakes, backwaters of rivers, swamps, mainly where you have standing water. And the mosquitoes lay their eggs on the water surface. You see 2 examples here. The top shows that those are individual eggs that have sort of come together in this star pattern on the surface of the water. And then the bottom photograph shows a raft of eggs. So there's 2 different ways they lay eggs on the surface of the water. That raft probably has about 200 eggs in it. These eggs cannot withstand drying out, and they do need to hatch within about 48 hours for them to survive. But again, these eggs are laid on the water surface, and that's a little bit different from floodwater eggs. Mosquitoes that lay their eggs in these sort of conditions are really looking for a moist substrate, not for standing water. So some examples of that would be in a salt marsh, where that salt marsh starts, the waters have receded and it starts drying down. You get this mud that forms cracks in it. On the inner walls of those mud cracks, it's moist, it's humid in there, and the mosquitoes will lay their eggs in there. Those eggs do require a drying out period, and then once that habitat is flooded again, the eggs will hatch. Same thing with a container. If you have like say a flower pot that has a little bit of water in it, the mosquitoes will lay their eggs above the water line, and then when that habitat gets flooded, maybe with irrigation water, and water comes into contact with it, then those eggs will hatch. And these floodwater eggs, for example, with the salt marsh mosquitoes, can survive up to a year. It's amazing how long they can last in this phase. So one of the things I want to mention about both of these is that these aquatic habitats we're talking about really have to be still, slow moving or stagnant water. If there's any kind of wave action or disturbances, that'll actually prevent them from coming to the water surface to breathe, so they don't like those kinds of areas. And then this just shows you an example of one of the permanent water mosquitoes. This is Culex quinquefasciatus, laying a raft of eggs. You can see when she first begins to lay them that they start forming a raft. They're sort of creamy colored, and then they harden over time, and they'll turn dark, and then they will hatch. So here I'm showing some examples of some mosquito habitats that I thought might be of interest, again, for campground and land managers. The top left photo is what we call a pool, an ephemeral pool. So you have low-lying areas that when there's rain in the area, they fill up, and they may last for a couple of days, maybe a few weeks, but we do have some mosquitoes that love that sort of habitat. On the right-hand side of the screen, we have two examples of a tree hole. So these are naturally formed in trees, and then some of them actually collect water and they get a little bit of organic matter in there, and we have several species that will inhabit tree holes. And then one of the permanent water sites is down on the bottom left, and this would be like a cattail marsh or a cattail pond, where we have a mosquito that's actually a little bit different from all the others, and attaches its breathing siphon to the roots and stems of cattails. So these are all natural habitats. And then I wanted to show one that's an example of what we would call, influenced by humans. Here's a trash bag at a campsite that hopefully wasn't intentionally left out in the open. Maybe it was opened by animals, and the trash gets thrown around. And all those things you see in the photograph, the plates, the cups, the Tupperware dishes, all of that there can hold water, and it can hold enough water for these container mosquitoes to lay their eggs and to finish their life cycle there. So these are certainly things we want to try to prevent as much as possible. This is an example kind of highlighting the diversity of mosquitoes we have in the United States. I wanted to mention we have about 3,000 mosquito species that have been identified globally. Within the US, we have a little over 175 species that we're aware of. And this shows you kind of the extreme ends of the small and the large mosquitoes. So that the Saurophora genus, which is the one on the top there, those are some of the largest mosquitoes we have in this country. And then the smallest one is Uraneitania. They're so small that sometimes when mosquito biologists are first learning to identify mosquitoes, they kind of overlook these because they don't think they are mosquitoes, but they are. And that's the genus represented in the photo I showed you earlier of mosquitoes that feed on frogs. And it's also the one that I mentioned that feeds on earthworms and leeches. And if you do a YouTube search for mosquito feeding on earthworms and leeches, you'll find a great video of watching that occur. So one of the ways that we identify mosquitoes is by looking at scales and hairs that cover the body. They're different colors, and they're different sizes and have different shapes to them. And I've just put a few examples up here of some that occur in the Northeast. I mentioned the cattails earlier. So in the upper left-hand corner, Coccolitida perturbans is the cattail mosquito. You can see the nice stripes on the legs, part of the identifying features. And then to the right of that is Culicida melanura. This is the enzootic vector of Eastern equine encephalitis virus. And then just below that, Aedes sollicitans is what we call a bridge vector. So it's one of those mosquitoes that can transmit Eastern equine encephalitis to humans and horses. And then in the bottom center, we have Culex pipiens, and this is a well-known vector of West Nile virus. So I did want to mention, I told you I was going to talk about two mosquitoes that really are here because of humans. Aedes albopictus, you might have heard of. This is called the Asian tiger mosquito. It's hadn't been seen in the United States until the 1980s, and it was introduced into the country through shipments of used tires. Since its introduction along Texas and Florida, it's really made a home here. It's become established in those areas that are the darkest green, where the habitat is very likely to occur. In recent years, we know there's been a shift, and we've seen some expansion of this range, really having to do with people moving things around, moving containers, moving used tires, the kinds of things where this mosquito likes to lay its eggs. And The lighter the green in here, the least, you know, you start getting into this area where this mosquito isn't likely to come established. But this was based on data we had in 2017, and we know this is changing fairly frequently. You can see in this map, Nebraska and Utah are just kind of in this area where it's really unlikely to occur, but we know last summer we found some pockets of Aedes albopictus in these areas that they didn't become established, and they haven't really moved out of that range, but just wanted to give you an idea of where they are now, and it's just something to keep an eye on. And then the next one I wanted to talk about is Aedes japonicus, another invasive species that can make its home in containers, tree holes, used tires. This mosquito was first documented in the US in 1998 in Connecticut. Subsequent to that, it was found in New York and New Jersey, and now you can see it's been found throughout most of the eastern states, and then in a couple of states in the Northwest. We know this mosquito is medically important in other areas. It can transmit Japanese encephalitis, which we don't have here, but we've also found positive, these mosquitoes positive with West Nile and La Crosse virus in this country. So it's also one to keep an eye on. And it's during the act of blood feeding that a mosquito becomes infected with a virus, which is what we're focused on today, or some other pathogen. And we really have two main sort of cycles of a mosquito-borne virus transmission. On the top right-hand side of the screen, it's showing one of those is basically where the pathogen goes from mosquito to human to mosquito. The other one is a little more complex, where you have mosquito going to some other host like a bird, back to the mosquito, and then to another host. Perhaps it's a bird, or it could be a horse or a human. When we think about mosquito human to mosquito cycles, those are the diseases that fall into that category are dengue, Zika, chikungunya, yellow fever, and then the more complex life cycle there is where we see Eastern equine encephalitis and West Nile virus fitting in. And this shows you for the United States, kind of over time, the mosquito-borne diseases we've been aware of, and how that has changed throughout time. In the 1800s, this was a time when it wasn't even known that mosquitoes were vectors of something that could cause these illnesses, but we do know that there were cases of dengue, malaria, and yellow fever in the 1800s. 1900s, we started seeing, in addition to yellow fever was pretty much gone by the early 1900s, but then we're still seeing cases of dengue and malaria, but we've added Eastern equine encephalitis, La Crosse, St. Louis encephalitis, and Western equine encephalitis into the ones that are present in the US. And then in the 2000s, we've added several more to that list, including chikungunya, Jamestown Canyon, and then one of the recent ones that have been in the news would be Zika virus. So the speakers coming up are going to talk a little more in detail about which ones are more of a focus in Region 1, but I did want to show you kind of the national picture of those that we're concerned about. And I also want to mention that when we count cases, we're including cases that are transmitted locally. So our local mosquitoes are actually infected with these viruses, and they're feeding on folks who live here, and then they are diagnosed with a disease. We also have imported cases. So a lot of these cases are travel related. So someone has gone to another country, say where malaria is endemic, and then they return to the US and they're diagnosed, but they actually acquired the infection elsewhere. So we need to keep that in mind when we look at what's actually going on locally. And you can see here the map on the left is kind of combining all these cases from 2004 through 2016. The darker blue, the more cases of mosquito-borne disease have been reported. And then just a comparison of 2017 and 2018. I really wanted to kind of highlight Zika virus because 2016 was the big year that we had local transmission, mostly focused in Miami, where local mosquitoes were infected and were infecting the folks who lived in that area. But in 2017 and 18, we really didn't see any more local transmission, but those numbers there reflect, people who did acquire the virus elsewhere, but they were reported by their doctors at home. So keep that in mind. But we just have this. It seems like every year or every few years we're adding a new disease to this list. I did want to say for this year it's still early in the mosquito season. We do have reported to CDC about 13 cases of West Nile. Most of those are focused in Miami, Florida, and we've had one Jamestown Canyon case and one La Crosse case. But again, we typically start seeing these numbers increase later in the summer, so end of July and into August and September. And then again, we'll have more detail in a minute, but I did want to highlight Eastern equine encephalitis, where we typically have probably 5 or less cases reported across the nation in humans in any given year. Last year was a very big year for human infections, where we've had 34 cases that are reported. This is the most fatal of the diseases of the mosquito-borne diseases that we have in this country. So it's certainly one we, it was bad news to hear that we had 34 human cases last year. And for the resources, I've listed here our mosquito site, which is fairly new for CDC. We tried to put all of our mosquito-related documents in one place. We also have each of the diseases listed separately, but I've put here the 2 I've mentioned today, Eastern equine encephalitis and West Nile virus, in case you wanted to go directly to those. And then ArboNet, it's a system where cases are reported to the CDC, and then they're placed on a map, and that's where we display the information to the public. If you go to this site, you have pull-down menus where you can select if you want to look at human cases, horse cases, mosquitoes, and see where they're occurring, and it gives you various years you can choose from as well. I don't have it on my slide because I believe I got the email while I was on the listening to the introduction to this meeting, but we do have a publication that's coming out tomorrow in the MMWR, and it is a joint publication with EPA talking about the importance of continuing mosquito surveillance and control during pandemics and natural disasters. So thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it back over to Andrea.
Thank you so very much, Roxanne. We will now hear from Matthew Osborne from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health.
Hi, this is Matt Osborne. I'm a vector-borne disease epidemiologist here at the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. I've been with Massachusetts for over 15 years working on vector-borne disease in varied capacities. I have an entomology background, and I've been fascinated with mosquito-borne disease for longer than 15 years. So we'll go right into diseases of concern here in Massachusetts. So I'm going to reference a lot of the mosquito-borne diseases in the Northeast. These are all diseases that are troubling to us here in the Northeast, but since I'm from Massachusetts, I'm going to focus on the program that we have here. I'm going to talk mainly today about 2 mosquito-borne diseases and reference a third, and you've heard about these already. Eastern equine encephalitis, which I'll probably refer to as triple E to save time. We've talked about already that these have bird-biting mosquitoes that transmit the virus, and mammal-biting and bird-biting that transmit the virus. So we have enzootic vectors. Those are the bird-biting mosquitoes. They transmit the virus to the birds, and the virus is amplified in the bird population, and then more mosquitoes feed on the birds, thereby amplifying it more. The epizootic vectors are the mosquitoes that transmit the virus to humans or incidental dead-end hosts because they feed on both the birds and the mammals. So for our enzootic vector for Eastern equine encephalitis, it's Culiceta melanura, and you're already shown a picture of that mosquito. And our epizootic vectors are Aedes vexans, Cochleotidia perturbans, Culex salinarius, and Acrototus canadensis. And in Massachusetts and likely throughout the Northeast, Cochleotidia perturbans plays an outsized role in transmitting Eastern equine encephalitis. Already this year in Massachusetts, we've had 7 identifications of triple E in mosquitoes, and they've all come from Coquetidia perturbans, which is worrisome, as that is a mosquito that would transmit it to humans. And as has been mentioned, triple E is the most severe arboviral disease in the U.S., and it has an extremely high mortality rate, and we'll get into that in just a moment. West Nile virus is much less severe, although quite a bit more prevalent in Massachusetts and in our area. The vectors of concern are Culex pipiens and restuans, and that's Culex restuans, and Acrotatus japonicus or Aedes japonicus, and these are all container breeding species. The species that I mentioned for triple E, these are all woodland species that are very difficult for, say, a campground to control. You can identify where they might be breeding, but it's very difficult for anyone to control them. But for West Nile virus, these are container breeding species. So if you can identify containers and empty them, you can limit transmission on your campgrounds or just by or through residential emptying. The last virus I want to talk about is Jamestown Canyon virus. It's been around for a while, but it's relatively new to human disease. We believe it's transmitted by Acrotatus canadensis, and we see very few cases annually. 1 to 5 cases is about, 5 is about our max, and 1's pretty typical for us. But I'm going to focus on the other viruses that have higher mortality or more severe. And this map is produced by the CDC. It's all the triple E virus neuroinvasive disease cases reported by the states of residence from 2009 to 2018. So it does miss last year, where we had an unfortunate banner year for triple E. And you'll notice on this map that it's truly an eastern seaboard type of disease, where the virus is traveling up and down the eastern seaboard. And if you look at Massachusetts, it's a fairly small state in comparison to other states, but we have quite a few more cases than most other states. New York had 8 cases, Massachusetts had 10, and Florida had 13. And the reason that Massachusetts tends to have more cases is because the habitat is perfect for Culoceta melanura, and then alongside of Culoceta melanura, we have abundant Coquetidia perturbans breeding sites. This is a graph showing you the Massachusetts cases of West Nile virus and triple E by symptom onset date. And it's really to give you an idea of trends, not so much of a specific year, but the idea of when do we see human cases and why do we care when we see human cases. So if we look specifically at West Nile virus, which is represented by the blue bars, you can see that it's not until late July that we start seeing human cases here in the Northeast. And then that trends upwards into early September and trends downwards into October. The mosquitoes that spread and transmit triple E are container breeding, so they can exist so long as environmental conditions are appropriate. They can continue breeding as long as we have warm weather. And as many of us know, we've had some warm October, so they can continue transmitting right through October. If you look at triple E represented in the red bars, it's kind of a different story altogether, where we see the same pattern start out, late July, and it trends upwards slightly through early September, and then it really drops off dramatically. And the reason for that is that the main vectors of concern are really starting to die off at that point. So Coquetidia perturbans is likely our main vector. And its life stage is ending at that point. So the adults are dying off, and that's why we tend to see fewer cases. We still will get late stage cases, but they may be transmitted by that 1 or 2, remaining old Coquetidia perturbans just hanging on. Triple E symptoms the incubation period for triple E is 2 to 10 days from the time of the bite, and the symptoms are characterized by headache, high fever, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, lack of energy, seizures, and ultimately coma and potentially death. And one of the worst statistics that we have is that 2 out of every 3 individuals who are infected either won't survive or will suffer severe neurological complications. And in Massachusetts, our case mortality rate is about 50%. Which is high compared to other states, which run around 30%. So it is a very severe arboviral disease, and unfortunately, it impacts both children and the elderly. Individuals who are more in the middle stages of life, 20s, 30s, they can survive. 40s and above tend to succumb to the virus on occasion, and unfortunately, young children often do not survive. West Nile virus has an incubation period of 3 to 15 days following the mosquito bite. And if you look here, 80% of our cases are either asymptomatic or subclinical. So a few years ago, we had 49 reported cases in Massachusetts, which means that there were hundreds of cases walking around who were asymptomatic. And only 20% get West Nile fever, and they may think that this is just a summer flu. So if you're a young, healthy adult, and you get a fever, body aches, headaches, swollen lymph glands, in a normal non-COVID year, you might just think that this is a summer flu and go about your business. And sometimes, older individuals will get tested, but we're missing hundreds of cases every year because people are just walking around with this until they get better. Less than 1% of our cases, 1 in 150, develop a neuroinvasive disease, and that could be encephalitis, meningitis, or poliomyelitis, and that's characterized by headache, high fever, neck stiffness, disorientation, coma, and occasionally death. The mortality rate for West Nile virus is exceptionally low and really impacts the elder age groups. Almost all of our deaths occur in individuals that are older than 60 years of age. This is Culex pipiens, our primary West Nile virus vector. You've already seen its cousin down south, which is Culex quinquefasciatus. They are related, and morphologically they're almost identical. But again, we're just focusing on the idea that they're container breeders. And if we look at where they're breeding, this is it. So tires, if you have tires anywhere on your campground or nearby, just get rid of them, because tires are the perfect breeding apparatus for mosquitoes. There's no orientation in which they cannot hold water. But if you can identify any containers, tarps, anything like gutters, things like that are blocked. I was just doing my gutters the other day and they were blocked, and Culex was breeding in them, and I felt stupid for letting that happen. But here we are, and we can take measures to reduce the likelihood of transmission for West Nile virus. And again, this is all accompanying other measures like awareness and using personal protective equipment, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So Massachusetts has a very robust arbovirus data collection and evaluation program here at the State Laboratory and State Health Department. We have a field collection program that's been in existence since the mid-50s. We set and collect mosquito traps from long-term trap sites in southeastern Mass. And again, these trap sites have been in existence since the 50s. So we have all of that data to compare current data trends to. We also provide surveillance coverage to 40% of the state that's not covered by mosquito control projects, which means that 60% of the state is covered by mosquito control projects who do a fantastic job at what they do. We have a laboratory testing and reporting of results program here. We have a molecular division and a viral serology division where we test specimens for Triple E and West Nile virus infection. For mosquitoes, our turnaround time is about 24 hours from time of receipt, which is fantastic because it allows us to take steps to reduce the likelihood of transmission at that point. Our suspect animal and humans are also tested through our viral serology and molecular programs, and the turnaround time for those is quite low as well. Our epidemiology program conducts disease surveillance and risk communication, and I sit within the epidemiology program. We identify areas at risk for disease transmission. We conduct case finding and investigation. So anytime that we have a suspect animal or human, we're going to do an investigation of that person to see where they were and where they acquired the virus so that we can increase the risk level in that area accordingly. We communicate all detections with our local health agents who are our partners on the ground, all of our mosquito control projects, and the general public to make sure that they are aware. We provide information to guide the decision-making processes to reduce the risks of human transmission, and I'll get into that a little bit more on our next couple of slides. But that could include, increasing the awareness at the local level, doing a lot more outreach to ensure that stakeholders are communicating to campgrounds the need to either curtail certain activities or make sure that people are wearing EPA-approved repellents. And at the end stage of that would be a decision-making process for aerial adulticiding or aerial pesticide use. These are some of our mosquito traps. So if any of you are on campgrounds and you happen to see these, you should not disturb them, and hopefully the people who put them there told you about them in the first place. But these are our mosquito traps in use, and these the one on the left is our CDC miniature light trap. This is our primary trap for primary trap for triple E surveillance, and it's a very effective yet simple tool. It uses a light bulb as an attractant, and then we add CO2 gas to it as a long-range attractant. And this trap can collect upwards of 40,000 mosquitoes in one night, in which we count and determine species and submit for testing here at the state lab. The trap on the right is a little bit easier to work with. It's our gravid trap, and that's specific to our West Nile surveillance program. And as the mosquitoes take blood meals, develop eggs, they need a place to lay those eggs, and you'll see that water below there. That's a fantastic container for laying eggs. So they go in there thinking they can lay eggs, they get sucked up into the trap. And the nice thing about that trap is because they've already fed on blood, they're more likely to have virus. So it's a lot easier to detect West Nile virus from that trap than it is to detect triple E from the other trap. This is a trend line that's similar to one of the other ones that I showed you, and it's for West Nile virus, but it's equally useful for triple E. The idea here is the distance between initial mosquito detection and human onset cases. So what we're looking at is that we can say we have early detection out there in week 26, where we're getting mosquitoes testing positive for either West Nile virus or triple E, and then 2 to 3 weeks later, we're seeing cases that had been exposed that now have the disease. We have that window of time to act appropriately by ensuring awareness of this disease in the environment occurs and making sure people are taking all necessary steps to protect themselves. The other thing that's important about this graph to notice is if you look at the line, the red line, which is positive mosquito samples, and you follow that trend line up, you'll notice that as the mosquito samples increase, so too do the human cases. So as we get up towards the peaks of these, we're looking at more and more human cases. So this is all information that we've had years past. We have lots of data. These types of data sets help us evaluate the need for ground-based spraying and aerial adulticiding to control mosquitoes when personal protective efforts are not enough. So Massachusetts utilizes a variety of prevention and response mechanisms to deal with mosquito-borne disease. We have the Arbovirus Surveillance and Response Guide that's produced by the Department of Public Health. It's posted publicly, and the listing is right there for you to click on if you so wish. It's updated annually, and we used a phased response system to deal with findings of both human, animal, and mosquito disease. And this is very helpful for campgrounds as you can actually watch in real time and plan out ahead what actions might be necessary if you were to get to a certain phase and if your risk level increased to a certain point. Certainly canceling of evening outdoor activities has happened in the past, and we're probably in year 2 of a 3-year triple E cycle. So everybody should understand that even with COVID going on, triple E is not just going to stop, and we're seeing it this year already. So looking at this guide, you'll get a whole bunch more information on how triple E spreads, what areas we typically see it in, and how we would make risk recommendations. We also communicate with our partners in local health and residents using communication tools like weekly reports, including risk messaging. We have a dedicated website with an interactive mapping portal. We have a 24/7 epidemiology program hotline. So we have many epidemiologists that are very well versed in answering questions from the general public. And we use risk reduction and prevention strategies. Most of those are geared towards the idea that personal prevention is the foundation of all awareness and mosquito avoidance. So using the proper mosquito repellents, using the proper clothing, being aware of the situation, and avoiding the mosquitoes that are most likely to transmit the virus, those are all tools that can be used to limit mosquito-borne disease. At the very tail end of this is aerial adulticiding. Sometimes, unfortunately, when the diseases become too great to control with ground-based spraying, aerial adulticiding or aerial pesticide use has to be considered. And last year in 2019, 6 independent aerial adulticiding efforts were conducted to control EEE mosquitoes here in Massachusetts. These are just a few examples of our risk communication tools. These are maps at the end of our last season. And if you look at the one on the left in blue, that's our EEE risk map. And you can see just from that that it was a pretty severe year. The Southeast is our area of historical risk, but if you look beyond the Southeast region from our Bristol County and Plymouth County, you'll see that there was activity in Central Massachusetts, Northeast Massachusetts, Franklin County, and nearly all over the state. And we're not always able to trap every municipality, so there's always the potential that there's more activity out there that we didn't detect. So that's why we've increased our range this year. If you look on the other map, we actually had a pretty good West Nile year, thankfully, because EEE was taking up all of our time, but we were actually likely detecting more West Nile because we're doing so much surveillance for EEE. So I just want to give you a very brief preview and end stage of what EEE looked like when it first started here in 2019. So this is the first week that we had it, 7/8 to 7/14/2019. And you'll see the blue dots in New Bedford and Easton, Massachusetts. Those are Culex melanura. Those are the primary enzootic vectors for EEE. We found those, detected those, and just a few weeks later, we're seeing a lot more widespread activity, and that's 7/22 to 7/28. And what you're seeing there with the circles within circles, those are mammal biting species as well. So now we know that there's the potential for this disease to be transmitted to humans. And this is the step that we started thinking right here and a little bit before that aerial adulticiding may need to come into play. We've increased our risk levels in this area by 729 to 84, and now outside this zone, we're starting to see activity popping up in central Massachusetts. I don't have time to take you through everyone, even though it's a fascinating look at our mosquito season. But if you look at the end of the year here, you're seeing that wherever we detected large amounts of mosquitoes, they're also associated with human disease. So we're getting human and animal disease in those areas where we're getting the most EEE detections. So in southeastern Massachusetts and in central Massachusetts. We ended the year with 428 EEE mosquito samples, 12 human cases with 6 deaths, and 9 animal cases. All were euthanized. And this year certainly could have been worse if aerial adulticiding had not intervened and limited the population for these species. So Dr. Connolly talked about Aedes albopictus, and I just wanted to pick up our efforts here in Massachusetts. Although we have to deal with EEE, West Nile virus, Jamestown Canyon, some other ones, we're also on the lookout for invasive species because they could play a role in disease transmission here in Massachusetts. So Aedes albopictus, its habitat is a container breeding species. It's very well associated with urban environments. Its host preference is mostly humans, which is actually surprisingly a good thing. It does feed on humans, cats, dogs, other small mammals. But since the viruses for both West Nile and EEE are held in the bird population, it would have to feed on the birds in order to transmit West Nile or EEE, and it does not seem to feed on birds all that often. So its role as a vector of existing mosquito-borne disease in Massachusetts is somewhat limited and somewhat untested. However, in its native habitat, it can transmit tropical diseases and is an extraordinarily efficient vector for those tropical diseases. So we are looking at this to establish its boundaries in Massachusetts. And one of the questions that we had early on that Dr. Connolly kind of mentioned is, are these annual introductions or are these populations established? So we did testing here on the grounds of the state laboratory, and we determined that over the course of 3 winters that this mosquito is well established and could establish, especially in protected overwintering environments. So think tires buried in the ground or any other structure that has some insulation around it. They can survive no problem, even in the coldest winters that we've had. And I want to end off just by showing you some of the disease resources that are appropriate possibly for your areas and your facilities. All of these are available on the link that's been provided, and they talk about how to avoid mosquito bites, Triple E prevention, and they're really good infographics developed just for this resource. So if you have any needs, you can find them there. And you also, as you look on this site, you'll link back to all of our other resources for Triple E, West Nile virus, and arboviral disease in Massachusetts. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We will now hear from Priscilla Matten, who is the Bristol County Mosquito Control Superintendent.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today to Region 1. I'm part of a organized mosquito control project here in Massachusetts, and I know that we're covering many different states and many different regions, so things might vary differently. So I'm going to try to give an overview of some of the things that you can do around your area, your campground, your recreational area to help reduce mosquitoes. And I want to emphasize using all of the information that has been previously provided to help respond to the mosquitoes through the data that you can find either through the CDC or through your local state or local health department. So those of you who participated in the presentation before about how to avoid ticks, I wanted to just give some quick differences as you're trying to make your decisions on how to avoid mosquitoes and how to tell those people that are using your facilities how to avoid mosquitoes. So different from ticks, mosquitoes fly to their hosts. So you might have learned with ticks, you go into their habitat, you're walking along trails, you're along the edges of the property, places where, ticks are more common, whereas you can be almost anywhere and a mosquito may fly to you. So that can be urban, rural areas. They're not quite as restricted as ticks can be. And we heard that because of the types of habitat that they use. Everything from man-made plastics and containers to areas where there are actually wetlands and local areas. Host feeding preferences, you learn, are quite variable, whereas ticks, the ones that we're more concerned with, mosquitoes fly for miles. So try not to think of just where you might be and what risk you might have. So use those risk maps that the states provide to look at where you might be and what areas are riskier close to you. Because again, they may fly, like those salt marsh mosquitoes, up to 20 miles. So you may not be in an area where you think certain mosquitoes are present, but they might be. So keep an eye on that as you're deciding where it is that you're traveling to. Also, just the sheer number of mosquitoes versus the amount of ticks that we're worried about in this region. There's about 3 ticks that we're mostly concerned about, where we can be concerned of over 50 different species of mosquito. In Massachusetts, about 13 of those 53 species play an active role in disease transmission. And disease risk has to include sort of an overlap. You need to have the species present at the same time that you have the disease present in the birds in order to sort of increase your risk level. And as Matthew had explained, controlling Triple E mosquitoes can be very difficult because they use more natural habitats, whereas West Nile virus is slightly more common to be in man-made habitats or those containers. So don't always just worry about disease risk. You should be worrying about nuisance as well. So some mosquito control organizations or services can be public or private. So in Massachusetts, we have an enabling state legislation which allows towns or cities to join a district, and we offer full services, the whole integrated pest management plan. Connecticut runs government surveillance and testing, but does not do any real treatment. Rhode Island does government surveillance and testing with the Department of Public Works catch basin control program, which is important for West Nile virus. New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine all run government-run surveillance and testing, but they do use private companies to provide pesticide application to supplement some of the mosquitoes that are submitted for testing within the state. So all of our organizations and states might work just slightly different. So what that means is that if you have a state or a municipal mosquito control program, we are grounded in certain rules and regulations of which we should follow. And some different programs or states are going to offer different services to their residents. All of Massachusetts applicators are licensed with the state, and some have special mosquito control endorsements. In Massachusetts, we have our federal NIPTES permit, which is run by EPA, and so is New Hampshire's, whereas the other states are run locally. We have state permits that we're required to comply with, as well as state regulations. We work closely with our state departments to produce what we consider to be best management practices, such as the Public Health State Surveillance and Response Plan, Endangered Species Act information, mechanized water management work. And then on a town or local level, we can have individual conservation commissions that we work closely with on what we're doing, as well as the department or the local boards of health. So these are important to consider what your requirements might be as a land manager or a facility manager. If you decide to do any mosquito control on your property, you want to just make sure that you're complying with all state and federal regulations. What we try to do in Massachusetts is we try to continue with using an IPM approach. And this is important because IPM is the backbone for all mosquito control. Sorry. Surveillance. So Matthew talked about surveillance, and surveillance is the cornerstone of any integrated pest management plan. We understand that you don't have traps on your property that you may own or be using, or the ability to identify mosquitoes, but that doesn't mean you can't go out onto your property and look for adults, look for mosquito habitat, and just being present in the environment can tell you what is going on. Chances are if you're walking and hiking or cleaning up around your facility and you're bothered by mosquitoes, those people that are using your facility are also probably being bothered by mosquitoes. Source reduction, water management, biological controls, education, and personal protection are all things I think we can all get behind. As far as chemical control, whether it's larviciding, pupaciding, or adulticiding, I'm not really going to speak about that. It's sort of a very complicated decision to make. And if you decide to pursue these options, remember to know if your organization, your recreational facility holds any sort of licenses or permits that you may hold within your state or your town. So for instance, in Massachusetts, we have daycares and we have day camps, where daycares are normally overseen by the Department of Education and day camps are overseen or licensed by the local boards of health. This brings into concern or into different types of legal requirements like the Children and Families Protection Act. So you need to make sure that you're watching and being aware of whatever rules or regulations you need to follow. And if you decide to make a pesticide application, use a licensed pesticide applicator, ask about the product that they're using, get the label, the federal EPA registered label, and use that information to decide whether or not this is the product and what you're looking to do and control. Because many times you may be wanting one thing and the product does something different. So one of the things we provide here in Massachusetts is a water management. Our goal is to remove debris and silt and vegetation from drainage ditches. This improves water flow. As was discussed, mosquitoes require stagnant water or standing water. Maybe there's something you can do by hand or mechanized with an excavator in order to keep the water flowing, in order to reduce the stagnant areas that might be in your area. as well as salt marsh restoration is something that we do in order to keep this water moving and reduce that sort of habitat. And source reduction is a huge thing that you can do, and you can ask your campers or your people that are using your facility to do tarps, boats, canoes, not just stuff that might be left by campers, but look around your workshop. As was discussed, tires are a really easy way of producing a significant amount of mosquitoes. And if you can remove your tires, you will definitely decrease some of those mosquitoes present. You want to maybe drill holes in your trash barrels if you don't have covers for them, anything to get the water out. You want to clean or change your water frequently during the summer. Mosquitoes can go from an egg to an adult in about 5 to 7 days, depending on how warm it is. So you're going to want to make sure that you're going through these areas as often as you can, and keeping an eye on what the campers may or may not be bringing in, and try to reduce that area as much as possible. Fish and fountains are kind of my sort of biological control sort of thing. Fish are a great biological control. I suggest that you contact your local Fish and Wildlife Agency to see what kind of guidance that they may be able to provide. Maybe they can even provide you with fish, depending on the type of habitat that it is. All fish pretty much eat mosquito larvae. Some are slightly better than others. You want to make sure that you're putting in species that are native to our area. We don't want any competing with native species, so it's good to contact your local, but see about equipment and availability of species that your state may have for you to help reduce the mosquitoes in large standing water areas. And fountains, again, as was discussed, mosquitoes need stagnant water. When you're just moving the water a little bit and making slight little ripples, you are disturbing their ability to come to the surface and attach to breathe, as well as disrupting the adult when it emerges from the pupal case. So it's something very simple that you can do that shouldn't cost too much money, that if you have large areas of wetlands, you can help reduce those mosquitoes. And then try to keep your information simple, something that is catchy, something that people will be interested in learning about, and use signage anywhere that you can. Bulletin boards, electric signs. During the EEE outbreak last year in 2019, the state put up signs on all our local highways about EEE activity. Newsletters, maybe your camp or your recreational facility has newsletters or handouts, posting at campsites, trailheads, restrooms, anywhere where you're going to get the most people to be present. If you have a check-in station, it's always important that you remind them. Provide them with the handouts that Matt had talked about that your state may have about disease risks or what you can do to prevent mosquitoes. And a very simple one that I like is sort of the 5 Ds of protection, this idea of dusk, dawn, dress, deet, and drain, on how to reduce mosquitoes when you're outdoors. So avoid those activities at dusk and dawn. Sometimes the states may restrict our activities during these times because this is when mosquitoes are most active. So keep that in mind. Maybe you are a facility that offers movie night. You should be aware of what's going on and whether or not you should be bringing together large groups of people, even outdoors, during those times. Dress appropriately, long sleeves and long pants when you're outdoors. This is the same thing that you probably heard for tick reduction. It's important to reduce the amount of exposed skin and to wear appropriate clothing when you can. And maybe provide repellents. You don't necessarily have to provide them for free, but maybe you can sell or provide EPA-approved repellents. It's been shown that what is provided or sold within your campsite or within your little general store is what people will use. So if you're providing them with EPA-approved repellents, they can read and follow the label. You can provide them with handouts that the state of Massachusetts has a very nice handout on mosquito repellents and how they are to be used. how you have to reapply, and all of this, I think you'll get your people that are using the area to actually use it. DEET is the most common repellent that we have. It's also good for ticks as well. Picaridin, oil of lemon eucalyptus. Read the label, follow the label. Permethrin is also great for ticks. However, it goes on your clothing or your gear, not when it's on you, physically on your body. So it's not necessarily the best thing to provide, but it's a good thing if you hand out or provide newsletters for people that are going to go to your area. You can recommend that they purchase some of this. And all of these things can be bought at your local stores. None of it is special, but you want to use and provide EPA approved repellents. And then again, that source reduction, right? So look around the property, see what you have. Maybe you have some abandoned swimming pools that you haven't been able to use or are not using this year due to COVID. Maybe areas that usually are highly populated by people and residents and used frequently will not be this year. So check those areas, get rid of those tires. If you have any sort of small standing water areas, get rid of them. And sort of my favorite little thing for the drain, that 50, is chuck it or check it. Get rid of it. If you don't need it, get rid of it. If you want to keep it, you want it at your facility, you use it for a reason, like water troughs for animals and dogs and stuff, little kiddie pools for dogs to cool off, that's fine. But dump that water every 3 to 5 days, scrub out those areas, those bird baths, and make it so that you're less likely to get mosquitoes in those areas. I didn't provide any information for areas to find more resources because, again, I'm going to point you to your local state resources through the Departments of Public Health, through the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, and certainly the CDC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. I would like to thank all of our panelists. Roxanne, Matthew, and Priscilla, for sharing their insights and expertise with us. We have also invited representatives from each of the 6 New England state pesticide regulatory agencies to join us. While most questions will be on topics raised by the presentations, we thought there might be some questions that deal with state-specific pesticide issues. EPA works closely with states on implementing pesticide laws. The states have primary responsibility for certifying pesticide applicators and for enforcing pesticide use laws in their states. Now is the time to pose your questions using the chat space on the right of your screen indicated by the red arrow. We'll begin our question and answer session after a few short announcements. As a reminder, you can download today's presentation by pressing the paper icon. Here are the Region 1 State Lead Agency panelists, and we'll respond to state-specific questions. We'll begin our question and answer session after announcements about available resources. Each of the state lead agencies have provided their websites where you may find additional information on their pesticide programs and on mosquito-related issues. The websites for Connecticut, Maine, and Massachusetts are found on this slide, and New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont are on the second slide. EPA resources are listed on this slide. Now we are ready for the question and answer portion of our presentation. We have quite a few questions already, so we'll answer as many as we possibly can. What is the percentage of DEET recommended by EPA? Priscilla, do you think you could handle that question?
I do. You need somewhere between 20% is about the average. Depending on the percentage of DEET depends on how long the application, when you spray it on, will last. So it's kind of similar to sunscreen. You need to reapply it often. 20% will get you about 4 hours. So if you're camping overnight, you're going to need to reapply more often. It's really not necessary to get anything with a significant amount of DEET, like 100% DEET or anything like that. The general ones that you can buy are perfectly good. You just need to make sure you reapply, make sure you read the label or check the label for information about sunscreen, what to apply first, and then when you need to reapply, especially if you're sweating or swimming.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. Matt, maybe you can answer this question. How effective are consumer mosquito traps similar to the CDC light traps in reducing mosquito populations and disease incidents? For example, a Dynatrap, which is a brand that's available to the public.
Yeah, there's a lot of varied research out there on those types of traps. They do capture a lot of mosquitoes, but what they're really doing is they're attracting mosquitoes to your property. So a lot of the manufacturers say that you'll note a diminished amount of mosquitoes within 2 to 4 weeks. But that actually coincides with most of the life cycles of these mosquitoes. So you would notice a diminished amount of them anyway. If you're going to use these tools, you want to place them as far away from your normal outdoor activities, so away from your decks and your patios. You want to place them as far away from that on your property as you can, so that they'll go to the trap and not to you, because they're attracted to movement, body heat, things like that. So if they come to the area looking for the trap, they're most likely going to go to you for a blood meal. So I'd say varied, but I don't recommend them.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Matt. We have a question for Matt again. Will DPH be considering adding tick monitoring in the future?
Unlikely. So tick monitoring is useful in other states. Most other states took advantage of the CDC program for active tick monitoring, but in Massachusetts, we have such high incidence of tick-borne disease that what we've seen is that most of the ticks that we're bringing back have some level of Lyme disease, babesia, or anaplasma. So a tick monitoring program is only going to tell us what we already know, that unfortunately we live with ticks that are infected. UMass Amherst has a passive monitoring program where residents actually send the ticks into UMass Amherst, and they collect the data and they share that data publicly. So we're using UMass Amherst as a partner in a tick monitoring passive capacity. We don't think an active role in Massachusetts is the right direction.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Matt. Roxanne, here's a question for you. I heard they were trying to sterilize mosquitoes. Is that feasible?
That's a great question, and that is what we're looking at right now. There's several different methods. Right now we're calling them novel methods of sterilizing mosquitoes, where the males are sterilized and then released and mate with wild mosquitoes, and then ideally you don't have, the population crashes. Right now, let's see, we just I do believe that there's an experimental use permit that was just issued for Oxitec to do a field test in the Florida Keys. So we're at the point right now where we're just trying to look at what they're doing, do an evaluation of that, and see, first of all, does it work? I will tell you also, there is a program in Lee County, Florida, where they're using X-ray technology to irradiate mosquitoes, and so they have this massive insectary going that they irradiate the mosquitoes and they release them, and I believe the beginning of this summer they had their first releases. So we're speaking with them and looking at their data to see at the end of the season, how did that work? Did it reduce the mosquito population like we thought it would? it might work for one of those species that has some very limited distributions, or you know, it's where it's limited in where it occurs. The issue will be kind of, once you've done that initially, how long do you need to keep that going? Because say with one of these container mosquitoes, for example, if that's what you were going to use, you might be able to release these mosquitoes and crash the population. But then you have people, you know, moving tires around and moving containers around. So you're going to have these continual introductions of that species. So we are looking at that now, but how that's going to look long term and in terms of feasibility and affordability, I would say stay tuned, because we are looking at that right now.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Roxanne. I guess, Matthew, this might be good for you, or Priscilla. Let's start with Matthew. The question is, when is a good time for trap monitoring? I'm not sure if they mean the time of year, or maybe you could just cover what would be a good time, seasonal.
Sure. So we start, if the question's surrounding like when do you start trapping, we start trapping in June and we typically end in October. But I'm betting the question might have something to do with time of day as well. So we're really setting up the traps earlier. They run off of a sealed lead acid battery for about 24 hours. Our ideal capture time is around dusk and dawn, and we get quite a few mosquitoes overnight as well. But really the bulk of our mosquitoes come into the traps around dusk and dawn. And that's actually when we're telling people to avoid mosquito activity, because that's when they're host seeking. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes. Priscilla, did you have any input for that as well?
Nope, I agree with what Matt said.
Okay, so another question we have is, I live in central Massachusetts. Is there a way I can contact my mosquito control district? Priscilla, maybe you could answer that?
Sure. So the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, or the State Reclamation and Mosquito Control Board more specifically, has a website. So mass.gov, you know, search mosquitoes. You'll end up at the State Reclamation and Mosquito Control Board. They have a list of all the mosquito control projects. And under the mosquito control project name, for instance, Bristol County Mosquito Control will be our number. And it'll also list the towns of which are part of my county. So maybe you don't know which county you're a part of, and some of us don't exactly have the correct name. So Central Mass Mosquito Control covers like 42 towns within Massachusetts, but certainly there is no Central Mass County. Same with Cape Cod, they are Barnstable County. So if you go onto the state's website, you can find which mosquito control project your town may be covered under.
Thank you very much. So this is a question I think maybe for Roxanne. The question is there any possibility of getting a vaccine for some of the mosquito-borne diseases?
So in terms of vaccines, right now there are a few that are out there available for horses, and you know, for humans there is the yellow fever vaccine. There are trials going on that look for that are testing vaccines for West Nile virus, but in terms of some of these other diseases you've heard about today, you know, we've kind of looked at this over the years. You know, why don't we have these vaccines? And part of it really has to do with numbers of cases that are out there. You know, the people who make the vaccines at some point need to get you know, their investments recouped, so to speak. And I think in a lot of cases, because you don't have, you know, they're very small numbers of cases compared to something like the flu, some of the companies aren't, you know, willing to invest the funding into developing those vaccines. So, yes, so I don't, I'm not sure if there will be one for West Nile virus in humans, but I do know it's being tested right now.
Thank you very much. I think this might be for Matt. What is the larval habitat for the enzootic mosquito Melanura? around
Yeah.
campsites, and how may they be controlled?
Okay, so the larval habitat for Culiceta melanura is a mix of cedar and maple swamps, typically in Massachusetts, although there are pockets of other areas like pine swamps where they will lay their eggs in. In these areas, there are crypts where the mosquitoes lay their eggs, typically underground, and that's where the larvae complete their life cycle underground. That underground environmental habitat makes them extraordinarily difficult to control because it's hard to get any sort of product into that habitat. I know Priscilla and others are working on ways to get product into those habitats, but right now it's exceptionally difficult to control. But remember, Culiceta melanura is not typically biting humans. It's the associated vectors like canadensis and perturbans and vexans that reside alongside of melanura that are actually biting humans. And those areas are also can be difficult to control if there's no roads to get to them. So in that case, in personal protective activities, using repellents, being aware, staying inside during peak hours, that's really the best mechanism for safety for everyone. And Priscilla may have more on the control part.
I agree with Matthew. It is extremely difficult to control in this habitat, as well as the sheer expanse of the habitat. Down here, Bristol and Plymouth County share a swamp complex called the Hockomock Swamp, and it's well over 2,500 acres of prime habitat for the enzootic Tripoli vector Culiceta melanura, and controlling it is extremely difficult.
Thank you both. Here's a question that maybe all three of you might want to weigh in on a little bit. Why are mosquitoes repelled by certain repellents, but others are ineffective? So why don't we start with Roxanne?
Thank you. That is a great question. When we go back and look at, first of all, why do some repellents actually work, and look at what is the response in the mosquito. Even some of that is difficult for us to know. We can determine that certain chemicals are repellent, but why they are and why they're not is a little bit harder to uncover. I think when you look at some of the things we put on our skin, if you start looking at some of the like some of the essential oils or some of the things that aren't really repellent, it could be a matter of they're evaporating quickly, they're not covering the skin well, but the actual reason why the mosquito is not responding, I think, remains to be seen. But when you just look at the products that are out there, some of these I think wear off awfully quickly, or maybe they weren't really repellent to begin with. You might have an oil where the mosquito can't actually just get its mouth parts into your skin, so it's not repellent. It just has a barrier there. So I guess that would be maybe the one of the reasons I could speak to about the natural products.
Okay, thank you. And Matt or Priscilla, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share?
This is Matt. I agree with Dr. Conley. There are some products that have been on the market for quite some time that contain active ingredients like DEET or picaridin, and even some of the more natural products do tend to work, like the lemon oil of eucalyptus. But the concentrations really matter. So if you look at a product like Avon Skin So Soft or something like that that has lower concentrations of an active ingredient, it's just not going to last for as long, and it's not going to provide the same active benefit. Some of the other products that are considered more natural, it's very hard to know how much active ingredient is in there and how active or repellent that ingredient really is. As Dr. Conley mentioned, some of these are oils that you can spread, and that may repel them just by a feeding process. But as soon as they evaporate or they're wiped away, then there's nothing to prevent the mosquitoes from feeding. it is really best to look at the options that have been proven effective for decades and to try to use those compounds that have been shown to be most efficacious.
Thank you so much. So I guess here's our last question, and I guess probably Roxanne might be best for this. Is DEET safe for dogs?
No. We haven't done any testing on it. Certainly we rely on what, EPA labels and the review that has been through there, but it is not recommended to apply DEET to your companion animals.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this concludes our webinar. Again, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge with us and our Office of Pesticide Programs colleagues at the EPA Center for Integrated Pest Management. We greatly appreciate your participation. Thank you so very much and have a good day.
Thank you.